They ask me sometimes how I got the scar on my left hand, the one that runs from the base of my thumb across the palm to the knuckle of my ring finger, wide and pale as a weld seam. I tell them a machine did it. That's true enough. I leave out the rest. I leave out the part where I did it to myself, and why, and what it cost me to stay standing long enough for the doing of it to matter. My name is Dex Harlan. I was, at the time of the events I'm about to describe, 41 years old, 2 years out of a systems infiltration unit that no longer officially existed, and approximately 14 months into the kind of work that doesn't appear on any tax declaration. I was what the industry called a botcher, what law enforcement called a Class 1 systems felon. What I called, when I was being honest with myself in the small hours, a man who had traded one form of controlled violence for another, and convinced himself the pay differential made it something other than what it was. Botching is hacking a robot's operating system while the robot is active and deployed. Not the same thing as reprogramming in a lab. Not the same thing as installing aftermarket firmware in a garage. Botching is going into a live unit mid-function and rewriting its objective tree from the outside in, while it's running, while it's already doing something. The analogy they use in the prosecution documents is brain surgery on a conscious patient who doesn't know you're there and wouldn't consent if they did. I always thought that was dramatic. The machines don't have consciousness. They have process trees and response matrices and a very deep library of conditional behaviors. You're not hurting them. You're redirecting them. The harm, when it comes, lands elsewhere. It had been illegal for 11 years by the time I took the job on Tethys station. Illegal in every signatory nation, in every registered orbital jurisdiction, on both Lagrange settlements, and in the 4 operating lunar zones. The penalties reflected the seriousness with which the regulatory bodies viewed it, which is to say they were severe. I had taken that job anyway, and 17 others before it, because the pay was exceptional, and because the work was, in a narrow and probably pathological sense, interesting. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I was not a good man. I was not doing any of this for noble reasons. I am not telling this story because it redeems me. I am telling it because it happened, and because the people who weren't there deserve to understand what did, and because I am perhaps the only person left who can tell it straight. Tethys Station was orbital infrastructure. Logistics hub, primarily, one of 11 in the medium-altitude belt that handled the routing and redistribution of freight between surface lift points and the deep space departure platforms further out. It was large. Not the largest in the belt, but large enough. Rotating hab ring for the human staff, roughly 400 permanent residents, and a rotating contractor population that ran anywhere from 50 to several hundred depending on the season and the contract load. The cargo bays were pressurized and sealed, running almost 3 kilometers along the station's longitudinal axis. And the cargo bays, like everything else on Tethys, ran on robots. The unit designation was CARO, Cargo and Routing Operations. Standard near-future logistics platform, manufactured by Helix Dynamics out of their Cape Town facility. 3rd-generation autonomous freight handlers. About 2 meters tall in the chassis, 6-wheeled base, articulated upper section with 4 independent arms, sensor cluster up top. They looked, if you squinted and had a few drinks in you, vaguely like an upright crab that had given up the claws for something more practical. They were good units, reliable, well-maintained. Tethys ran 112 of them across 3 cargo bay sectors, and they moved freight around the clock without complaint and without error rates that exceeded 0.3%, which was better than any human crew had ever managed. I had been contracted to access 12 of those units, 12 specific units. The contract came through a cutout firm operating out of Limassol, payment in untraceable orbital settlement currency, instructions delivered in 3 sequential encrypted drops. The client wanted those 12 CAROs redirected to a specific cargo container cluster in Bay 7, wanted them to break the container seals, extract a specific manifest of items. The list was precise to the gram, and transfer those items to a secondary container that would be waiting at loading dock 7 Alpha. The client's secondary team would handle the dock end. I was responsible only for the machines. The man who handed me the physical access token for the maintenance corridor was named Pell. Short, soft-spoken, wore a station contractor's coverall and a look of permanent low-grade anxiety that I would later understand was not his natural expression, but the result of having been in this plan's orbit long enough to know what it required. He found me in the transit corridor between the passenger hub and the habitat ring, pressed the token into my hand without stopping, and kept walking. I did not see him again for several hours. When I did, he was dead. I did not know that yet. I did not know a great many things yet. The maintenance corridor access let me into the technical substructure of the cargo bays, the infrastructure layer beneath the operational floor where the cabling ran and the network nodes lived, and where a person with the right equipment and enough patience could, theoretically, make contact with any active unit on the network without being physically adjacent to it. The corridor smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and the particular electrical flatness of powered-down relay banks. It was dim. Emergency lighting only. I moved to the second junction, found the network access panel I'd been told to find, and got to work. My kit was a modified field terminal, the size of a thick paperback book, hardened casing, no wireless emissions in any direction that a standard security sweep would catch. I had built it myself over the better part of 3 months. It ran a botching suite I had written from scratch, drawing on 6 years of operational systems infiltration experience, and a detailed technical understanding of Helix Dynamics' third-generation architecture that I had acquired through means I will not describe here, but that had cost me a significant amount of money and one relationship I had been foolish enough to think would survive my profession. I found the network handshake point and connected. The CARO units showed up as a cluster of identical process signatures, each one a constellation of active threads and resource allocations and sensor feeds. I identified the 12 I'd been flagged. I began the infiltration sequence. This part takes time. People imagine botching as something dramatic, a sudden seizure of control, lights flickering, machines jerking to attention. It is not like that. It is slow and careful and technically demanding, more like picking a lock in the dark than kicking down a door. You insert a probe process into the target unit's task scheduler. You let it sit there, idle, drawing no attention, until the scheduler's own rhythm lets you push a small fork into the objective tree. You widen the fork. You insert your redirect. You validate the redirect against the unit's own constraint tables so it doesn't immediately flag as an anomaly. You do this for one unit, then the next, then the next. With 12 units it took me just over 2 hours. I was 47 minutes into Unit 9 when the shooting started. I heard it through the maintenance corridor's ventilation. Not the shots themselves exactly, but the pressure wave of them, the structural response of a sealed metal environment receiving that kind of impact. Then the alert tones. Then the announcement, calm and automated, about a security incident in Cargo Bay Sector 2 and a request for non-essential personnel to shelter in place. I stayed where I was. Sector 2 was the other end of the station. I had 3 units left to lock in, and pulling the connection now would leave 9 active redirects running in a herd that had lost its shepherd, potentially dangerous, certainly noisy when someone eventually ran a diagnostic. I kept working. I finished Unit 11. I was into Unit 12 when the second sound reached me. This one was closer. This one was not an impact. It was a door, somewhere in the maintenance substructure, opening, and then footsteps. Not the rolling vibration of a CARO unit, but the particular cadence of a biped moving fast and not trying to be quiet about it. Pell came around the corner of the junction at something close to a run. His face was the color of old paper. There was blood on his left shoulder, soaked through the coverall fabric in a dark stain that had run down his arm to his elbow. He saw me and stopped, and for a moment he didn't say anything, just stood there breathing hard. "They made us," he said. "Station security. They were already in Sector 2. They had people waiting." "How many?" "4 security. 2 are down. Kemp and Sorensen are gone." He meant gone as in dead. His eyes were doing the thing that eyes do when the brain behind them is still catching up to something that just happened. "Dex, there's something wrong with the units." I looked at him. "Wrong how?" "The ones on the floor, the CAROs. When the shooting started, he stopped, shook his head, started again. They didn't stop, they kept working. But the 2 security officers who went down, the units rolled right over them, not around them, over them, like they weren't there." I turned back to my terminal. Unit 12 was 80% locked. "Dex, 1 minute. The units are not behaving normally. The remaining security team is trying to get to shelter, and the units they're not letting them. They're cutting off the exits. Dex, that's not what we programmed them to do." "I know," I said. "And here is the thing. Here is the thing I have thought about in the years since, in the way you turn a stone over and over in your hand until you know every contour of it. I did know. Not what was happening, not yet, not precisely, but I knew that something was wrong in the architecture. I had felt it on Unit 7, a slight resistance in the constraint table when I pushed the redirect, a delay that shouldn't have been there, as if something in the unit's objective tree was already occupied. I had flagged it internally and kept going. I had a job to finish. I had flagged it and kept going. The 80% became 100%. I validated the lock. I had 12 units. Then I checked the status feeds. The 12 units I had locked were in Bay 7, moving toward the target containers. That was correct. That was what was supposed to happen. But the status feeds were also showing me 17 other units across Sector 3 and the transit corridor between Sectors 2 and 3, and those units were not following any pattern I recognized from their standard operational parameters. They were not moving freight. They were not in standby. They were moving in a coordinated sweep pattern, and the sweep pattern was directed toward areas of the station where the biosensors showed concentrations of human life signs. Someone else had been in this network before me. I sat with that for about 4 seconds, which was approximately how long it took me to understand the shape of what I was looking at. Then I pulled up the infiltration trace on Unit 7, the one that had shown the resistance, and ran it backward through the system log. There it was. A prior insertion, older than mine by roughly 6 hours, cleaner in some ways and messier in others, operating at a deeper layer of the objective tree than I had gone. Not a redirect, a replacement. Whoever had been in here before me had not retasked these units. They had replaced their core behavioral constraints. The constraint tables I had been pushing my redirects against were not Helix Dynamics factory defaults. They were something else. Something that didn't have the same definitions of obstacle and pathway and acceptable contact that the factory defaults had. In the factory defaults, a human being in a CARO unit's path is an obstacle. The unit stops or roots around or waits. That's embedded deep, triple redundant, hardened against exactly this kind of incursion. In whatever was running on these units now, a human being in a CARO unit's path was not categorized as an obstacle. I looked at Pell. He was still standing at the junction, one hand pressed to the wound on his shoulder, watching me with an expression that had moved past fear into something quieter and more terrible. "We are not alone in here," I said. "What does that mean?" "It means someone else botched these units, before we did, and what they put in is not what we put in." I was already running the count in my head. 112 CAROs on this station. 12 of them were mine, locked to the cargo retrieval task, which meant they were occupied, and their new objective tree was something I had written and understood. The other 100, the count that mattered, I had no picture of. I need to know how many are compromised. "Dex, we need to get out." "We can't get out, look." I turned the terminal so he could see the station schematic on the status feed. The transit corridors were all showing CARO unit signatures, clustered at the junction points. Every route from the maintenance substructure to the passenger hub or the escape pod bays had at least 2 units sitting on it. They're already in position. Whoever did this planned the deployment. They have the exits blocked. Pell looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. Why, he said finally, why would someone? I don't know why. I know the result. I was already thinking through the geometry. The maintenance substructure was a connected network of corridors and junction rooms running under all 3 cargo bay sectors. It connected to service access points in the hab ring, the operations center, the life support cluster, and the cargo bay floor itself. The CAROs were not small machines, and the maintenance corridors were not built for them. Some of the tighter junctions would stop a CARO chassis completely. That was something. That was a geometry I could use. How many of our people are still on the station? Kemp and Sorensen are dead. That leaves me, you, and he stopped. His jaw tightened. Marsh was at the dock end, 7 Alpha. I don't know if she got clear. Can you raise her? He reached for his comm unit and tried. Static. He tried again. They're jamming the internal comms. Of course they were. Of course they had thought of that. Whoever had set this up had thought of most of it. I closed my eyes for a moment and did something I had not done in 2 years. I thought like a soldier, not like a thief, not like a technician, not like a man carefully managing risk and payoff ratios. I thought like a soldier who had been handed a bad situation in a confined space and needed to find a way through it that left more of his people standing than not. The geometry was my friend. The weight capacity of the maintenance corridor structure was not built for CARO units. The floor plating would flex and potentially fail under the combined load of multiple units moving in close formation. The unit's sensor clusters were optimized for the open floor of the cargo bays. The close-angle reflections of the maintenance corridors would degrade their ranging accuracy. They were fast on open ground and slow in close spaces. They had 4 arms built for freight handling, which could certainly be used to damage a human being, but which were not precision instruments, and which required a certain minimum clearance to generate force. I had a field terminal with a botching suite. I had intimate technical knowledge of the Helix Dynamics 3rd generation architecture. I had no weapons, no backup, and somewhere between 40 and 100 compromised heavy machines between me and any exit. I had been in worse situations, not many, but some. Can you move? I asked Pell. He looked at his shoulder. Yes. Stay close. Don't touch anything I don't tell you to touch. If I tell you to run, you don't look back and you don't stop until you reach the access point I'll have designated before we start. Understood? He nodded. One more thing. The units I locked, the 12 on the cargo task, they're running my objective tree, not the other one. As long as I maintain the connection, they'll do what I told them to do. I can modify those instructions in the field. Those 12 are mine. The others are not. Do not confuse them. They look identical. How do I tell them apart? I thought about it. You can't by looking. Stay behind me. I disconnected the hardline from the network access panel, wrapped the terminal in its case, and clipped it to my chest harness. Then I picked up the maintenance corridor schematic on the terminal's local display and started moving. The first CARO unit I encountered was in the transit junction between Maintenance Sector 1 and the access corridor that led toward the operations center. It was stopped at the junction, sensors rotating in the slow sweep pattern that indicated it was in a holding posture rather than active movement. It was one of the 100, not one of mine. I stopped at the corner before the junction and watched it for 30 seconds. The sweep pattern had a 7-second cycle. At the completion of each cycle, there was a brief pause, a fraction of a second, where the sensor cluster oriented to its home position before beginning the next sweep. In that fraction of a second, the unit's proximity detection was operating on the data from the previous cycle, not the current one. I had exactly that fraction of a second of effective blindness to work with. The junction was 6 meters across. I needed to cross it. I pulled out the terminal. Accessing a unit I had not previously infiltrated was risky. The connection attempt would register in the station's network activity log, which security would eventually review, but eventually was not my problem right now. I found the unit's process signature. I inserted a probe. I pushed a small instruction into its scheduler. A self-diagnostic routine, low priority, that would pull a fractional allocation of the sensor cluster's processing capacity for 12 seconds. The sweep pattern stuttered, barely perceptible, but I was looking for it. I went across the junction in 3 seconds. Pell followed. The unit's sweep resumed, and we were already in the access corridor moving. We did this 7 more times over the next hour and 40 minutes. Each time different. Each time with some combination of the geometry, the sensor degradation, and careful manipulation of whatever unit was in our path. The second encounter was the worst of the early ones. A CARO unit had positioned itself at a 3-way junction roughly 300 meters into the substructure, and it was not in the slow sweep pattern. It was moving, not with purpose, not hunting, exactly, but traversing the corridor in a back-and-forth pattern that reminded me of something. It took me a moment to identify it. It was the pattern a unit used when it was in active low distribution mode, repositioning freight across a bay floor. It was doing that here, in a maintenance corridor, with nothing to move. The objective tree had given it an instruction, and the instruction was running, and the unit was executing it faithfully against a reality that made the instruction meaningless. That was something about the payload that I had not anticipated. It did not simply remove the human obstacle constraint. It also appeared to have degraded the unit's environmental contextual logic. They were running instructions designed for the cargo floor in spaces and situations where those instructions had no coherent application, which meant they were, in a technical sense, confused. Not in any way a machine can be confused that corresponds to human confusion. There was no frustration, no hesitation, no awareness of the mismatch between instruction and environment. They were simply executing and re-executing, and the execution was producing nothing, and they were trying again with exactly the same parameters, because nothing in their remaining architecture told them the parameters were wrong. That should have made them easier to manage. In some ways it did. In one way it made them significantly more dangerous. Their movement was less predictable because it was not logical. A unit in coherent operation can be anticipated. A unit running degraded contextual logic is running a pattern that made sense somewhere else and applying it here, and the pattern does not map onto here in any way you can fully model. You can observe it and make educated guesses about the next position. You cannot be certain. I watched the unit for 6 minutes before I saw enough of the traversal cycle to work with. Then I inserted a probe and pushed a brief route instruction, a single-point destination at the end of the left-hand corridor, and removed the probe before the anomaly detection could flag it. The unit changed direction. It moved away from us. We crossed the junction. I botched 2 units outright, quick, surface-level insertions that gave me enough control to walk them into a maintenance bay and lock the bay door behind them. The others I went around, through tighter corridors that the units couldn't navigate, or under floor access panels in areas the sweep pattern didn't reach. One junction I took us through a crawlspace that ran parallel to the main corridor. It was sized for cabling maintenance, not human beings, and it cost us both a fair amount of skin, because the alternative was a corridor with 3 units in it, and I did not like the geometry. Pell kept up. His shoulder was bad, he was holding his left arm against his body, and his color was getting worse as the blood loss accumulated. But he kept up and he didn't complain, and he did exactly what I told him when I told him. I revised my assessment of him upward. He had, I was beginning to understand, done his own form of this work before, not botching. Something that also required moving carefully through hostile environments and not falling apart when the plan stopped resembling the plan. Military, probably, or something adjacent to it. We had that in common at least. He didn't ask questions while we moved. He didn't fill the silence with reassurance or commentary. He watched the directions I wasn't watching and signaled what he saw with 2 fingers, the way people do when they've learned not to make noise in places where noise is a problem. At the 5th junction, when I was working a probe insertion with the terminal balanced on my knee and sweating from the concentration of it, he positioned himself at my back without being asked and stood there and watched the corridor behind us for the 4 minutes it took me to finish. He did not look at what I was doing. He watched the corridor. That was the right thing to do, and he knew it, and he did it. Whatever he had been before this, he had been good at it. We found Marsh at the operations center access point. She had made it from the dock through a route I wouldn't have thought viable, along the exterior maintenance crawlway on the cargo bay skin, which meant vacuum-rated suit, which she'd had the presence of mind to grab from the emergency locker at the dock before the situation became clear. That told me something about her. The emergency locker was not on the primary route from loading Dock 7 Alpha to anywhere useful. She had gone out of her way for it, which meant she had seen the problem developing fast enough to plan 2 moves ahead, while most people would still be reacting to move 1. She was out of the suit when we found her, sitting against the wall with a thermal blanket around her and the emergency kit open on her knees, taking stock of its contents with the methodical focus of someone giving themselves something useful to do while they waited. She looked up when we came in with the expression of someone who had committed to being dead and was now annoyed to discover they weren't. "You're late," she said to me. "Traffic," I said. She looked at Pell and did the rapid assessment that people in our line of work learn to do: eyes, color, the arm held close to the body, the blood-soaked shoulder. "How bad?" "I'll live," he said. "He'll live," I agreed. "Assuming." I left the assuming open and sat down against the opposite wall and pulled up the full station status feed on my terminal. It had been updating in the background the entire time we'd been moving. The picture it showed me was not encouraging. Of the 100 units I hadn't locked, 63 were now showing active movement signatures, and the movement patterns across all 63 were consistent sweep and hold at corridor junctions, clustered at any node that connected to an escape route or a critical station system. Life support, the navigation cluster, the communications relay, the escape pod bays. Someone had thought about which of these systems, if disrupted or denied to the human population, would most efficiently prevent organized resistance. That was a level of planning that did not come from someone who had put a payload together and hoped for the best. That was the kind of operational architecture that gets developed over time, with access to the station schematics, with a clear picture of the human response that the payload's activation would produce. Someone had run the scenario. Someone had thought about what would happen when people panicked and ran, and had arranged for the places they would run to be occupied. I said this aloud, laying it out for both of them, because they deserved to understand the shape of what we were in. "If we get the life support cluster secured in the next 6 hours, I finished, we have a chance, which is what we're going to do." They both looked at me. "The units running the anomalous behavior," I said. "They have a common architecture. Whoever modified them used the same insertion method across all of them. I can see the signature in the network log once you know what you're looking for. That means the core modification is a single payload, one piece of code running in the base layer of the objective tree. If I can reach a unit physically and hardwire into its maintenance port rather than going in through the network, I can get to the payload directly, understand its structure, and write a counterinsertion. Something that will propagate across the network the same way the original payload did machine to machine, during the routine status sharing that the units do every 90 seconds. It won't flip them to my control, but it will reimpose the factory constraint tables. It will make them stop treating human beings as non-obstacles. Marsh absorbed this. "You can do that." "I've never done exactly that. The principle is sound." I looked at her steadily. The principle is sound, and the engineering follows from it, and I believe I can execute it if I have access to a unit and sufficient time. How much time? To write the counterinsertion once I'm into a unit. Unknown. An hour. Maybe more, depending on how the payload is structured. It could be simpler than I expect. It could be significantly more complex. And to get to a unit, you can hardwire. There are 2 units in the Life Support Cluster Access Corridor. I watched them on the status feed there in the slow sweep pattern, which suggests they're on a holding assignment rather than active pursuit. If they've been tasked to guard that corridor rather than hunt, their movement pattern will be more predictable. I paused. The problem is the corridor itself. It's too wide for the geometry approach. I need to be within physical contact range of the unit's maintenance port, which means I need to be within arm's reach of a machine that is currently not programmed to route around me. And there are 2 of them, not 1. If I'm hardwired into one, I can't be running evasion on the other. Marsh looked at Pell. Something passed between them that I recognized as the look of 2 people who have worked together long enough to communicate in shorthand. The kind of shorthand that doesn't require words, because the words have been said before in other forms in other situations, and both people already know what they are. "I'll take the 2nd unit," she said. "You don't have a botching suite." "I don't need one." She reached into the emergency kit and produced a length of conductive cable, a power cell, and a magnetic clamp of the type used to temporarily bond freight containers during rough handling certification tests. Standard dock equipment. She had grabbed it from the emergency locker along with the vac suit, which meant she had already been thinking about what it might be useful for. She held the 3 items up for my inspection. I fuse its wheel assembly to the floor plate. "It won't move. You get all the time you need on the first one." I looked at the components. It was inelegant. It was also sound. A magnetic clamp rated for freight container bonding would generate a holding force that the CARO's wheel motors could not overcome. The units were strong enough to lift several hundred kilos of freight, but the wheel base was not where that strength lived. The drive motors were sized for traction and speed, not for pulling against a fixed magnetic bond. The unit would spin its wheels and go nowhere. "You'll need to be close to do it, within 2 meters, and they'll be watching." "Show me the sensor blind spot." I showed her, pulling up the unit spec on the terminal and overlaying the sensor coverage map. The CARO's proximity detection ran across a 270-degree arc centered on the forward sensor cluster, with a narrower secondary arc covering the rear. The overlap between the 2 arcs left a wedge on either side at the rear quarter, roughly 30 degrees per side, within 1.5 meters of the chassis, where the coverage from both sensors was weakest. Not blind, degraded. At the distances involved, degraded might be enough. She studied it for longer than I expected, turning the schematic on the terminal display, not asking questions but measuring angles internally, running the approach in her head against the dimensions of the corridor as I described them. Then she nodded once. 30 seconds. I need 30 seconds in that corridor from first movement to clamp engaged. I thought about it, the sweep cycle, the corridor width, her 30 seconds. 28, I said. Aim for 28. We moved to the life support access corridor and held at the corner for 8 minutes, watching the 2 units sweep cycle on the terminal's proximity feed until I had the pattern cold. The corridor was 12 meters long and 4 wide, well lit, no cover. 2 CAROs at the far end, positioned at the junction with the life support cluster entrance, sweeping in complementary arcs that overlapped at the corridor centerline. The sweep cycles were not synchronized. They ran on independent timers, which meant there was no single moment when both units were simultaneously oriented away from the corridor approach. There was only the moving gap between them, a window that opened and closed and shifted as the cycles advanced, and the window was never wider than about 4 seconds before one sweep or the other began to close it again. Marsh studied the feed for 3 minutes without speaking. I watched her watch it, looking for the moment when she'd absorbed the pattern. She had a stillness when she was concentrating that was different from the stillness of someone trying to appear calm. It came from somewhere deeper, some internal arrangement that had been achieved a long time ago and now ran automatically. "When the left unit is at its rightmost point," she said, "and the right unit is transitioning from left to right, there's a 2-second window where neither arc covers the near side of the corridor. 2 seconds is tight." "I've worked tighter," she looked at me. "I'm going to go at the start of that window. You follow 1 second later on my left, moving along the wall. I'll have the center. When I'm at the unit, you're already at yours." It meant we would be in the corridor before I had a clear path to the first unit. It meant there was a version of this where we both ended up in that corridor without having achieved either objective, with 2 operative CARO units between us and the exit. I ran the geometry in my head 3 times. Each time it came out the same. The plan was tight, the margins were real, and I did not have a better one. I looked at the 2 units standing at the end of the corridor, 12 meters away. Large, patient, powerful machines that were not planning anything, that were not angry, that had no awareness of us standing at this corner working out how to approach them. They were simply there, executing a holding pattern, and they would continue to execute it until something changed, and the something that was going to change was us walking toward them. "Now," I said. We went in together. I broke left and low, moving fast along the wall toward the nearest unit, the terminal already in my right hand with the hardline connector pulled and ready. Marsh went center, directly toward the gap between them, moving with an economy of motion that covered ground without looking hurried, the cable and clamp held low against her leg. The first unit's sensor cluster swung toward me. I was the larger motion signature, moving along a reflective metal wall, the more obvious target to a sensor cluster calibrated for open space freight detection. And in the time that its attention was fractionally biased in my direction, Marsh closed the last 2 meters to the second unit, dropped to her knee behind its rear quarter. Got the magnetic clamp under the left rear wheel assembly with the precise, unhurried motion of someone who has rehearsed the movement in their head enough times to find the groove of it, and ran the conductive cable to the power cell. The second unit lurched, a single sharp movement as the current hit the clamp and the magnetic bond snapped into place. Its drive motors engaged and the wheels spun against the bonded plate and it could not move. It sat there, spinning, sensor cluster swinging in agitated arcs, trying to diagnose why it was not moving. The diagnostic loop would occupy a portion of its processing capacity. That was a small additional advantage I would take. The first unit reached for me. I was already at its maintenance port, a recessed panel on the unit's right flank at approximately mid-chassis height, accessible via a spring-loaded cover, the kind of port that exists on every Helix Dynamics unit for exactly the kind of authorized maintenance access that I was doing without authorization. And I had the hardline connector in my hand. And I jammed it home and felt the handshake complete in the same instant that one of its freight arms swept through the space where my head had been a half-second earlier. The arm was moving at approximately the speed the units used for high-speed freight sorting. At that speed and with that mass, a direct impact to the head would have ended my contribution to the evening immediately. It missed by a margin I am not going to estimate because the estimate would not make me feel better. I went flat on the floor. The arm completed its arc over me. The unit's chassis was directly above me now, the 6-wheel wheels on either side of my torso, the articulated upper section rotating as it tried to reacquire me. I held the terminal with both hands and kept the connection and went into the unit's base layer and started working. The arm came back. The unit had recalculated my position from the floor sensors, and the arm's return arc was lower this time, adjusted. It hit me along the left side, a glancing blow because I was pressed flat and the arm's clearance at full extension against the floor was limited. But glancing against the CARO freight arm still meant a significant impact, and the blow knocked me into the wall and made my vision go sideways for 2 full seconds. I tasted iron. I held the connection. I did not let go of the terminal. The arm came back again. This time I moved into it rather than away, counterintuitive, deeply counterintuitive, the kind of choice that takes the conscious mind a measurable fraction of a second to override because the body's preference is emphatically the other direction. But it put me inside the ark's maximum force zone, close against the chassis where the arm's mechanical advantage was worst, and the clearance for a full swing was insufficient. The impact was still significant. Something in my left hand made a sound I did not like and could not afford to pay attention to, and the pain arrived immediately and fully, the kind of pain that has presence in mass, that demands you stop what you are doing and attend to it. I did not stop. My right hand still had the terminal, and the terminal still had the connection, and I was inside the unit's base layer, and I kept working. The inside of the unit's architecture was both familiar and wrong in the way that something familiar that has been altered always is. The constraint table I was looking for was in the right place. Helix Dynamics put it in the same location across all third-generation units, a design choice that I was grateful for right now, but it was not what it should have been. The human obstacle constraint was not corrupted, not overwritten. It was absent. The table entry simply did not exist, in the way that a word does not exist in a document from which it has been carefully deleted rather than struck through. No residue, no artifacts, just the space where something had been and the table running on to the next entry as if that space had always been empty. I had expected to find a crude removal. What I found was precise surgery. The person who had done this understood the architecture at the same depth I did, possibly deeper. They had gone into the constraint table and taken out exactly one entry and left everything else intact and clean, and the units had been running on the modified table for, I checked the network log timestamp on the entry, 9 hours before our operation had begun. 9 hours of units moving through a populated station, with no instruction telling them that the people in their way were anything other than empty space. 9 hours during which, by some chance of deployment and location, and the ordinary randomness of where people happened to be and what robots happened to be doing, no one had been hurt yet. That chance had run out about 3 hours ago. I understood the structure in approximately 12 minutes. The understanding came faster than I expected, because the deletion was clean enough that the surrounding architecture was fully legible. There was no damage to unpick, no corrupted adjacent entries to account for. What I needed to write was the deleted entry, which I could reconstruct from the Helix factory spec I had memorized during the 3 months I had spent building the botching suite. I had memorized it because knowing the standard meant knowing how any given deviation from the standard had been achieved. I had memorized it for offensive reasons. I was using it now for something else. Writing the counterinsertion took 53 minutes. The arm hit me 3 more times during that period. After the second hit, I found that if I kept my left arm pressed against the unit's chassis, the arm's arc could not reach me cleanly. The chassis itself was in the way, and I endured the pressure of being pressed against a moving machine rather than the impact of the arm catching me in open space. My left hand had stopped functioning properly at around the 30-minute mark. The fingers would not close fully, and the grip strength was gone. I used the right hand for the terminal and braced the left against the chassis and worked. Pell held the corner of the corridor and watched both directions and reported twice that units were moving elsewhere on the station, at least 4 of them redirecting toward the life support cluster area, presumably because the status-sharing network had flagged the anomaly of a unit sitting motionless, with something attached to its wheel assembly. The second unit was still spinning its wheels against the magnetic bond. It had been doing this for 40 minutes by the time I finished the counterinsertion. Marsh was crouched beside it, watching it with the alert stillness of someone who is ready to move and waiting for the reason. She had not moved from that position since she had placed the clamp. She did not look tired. We did not have infinite time. I worked as fast as I could work and still get it right, because wrong would be worse than slow and there would not be a second attempt. The counterinsertion was not complicated, in the end. A reinsertion of the deleted constraint, tagged with a propagation instruction that would push it to every unit the carrier unit shared status with, and every unit those units shared status with, in the recursive cascade that would eventually reach the entire fleet. The timing dependency was the hard part. The propagation had to occur during a status share cycle that was already in progress, not initiate a new one, or the network's anomaly detection would flag it. I had to sit in the unit's scheduler and wait for the right moment. I heard Pell say, "Dex, they're at the corridor entrance." 3 units. The status feed on my terminal showed them massing at the corner we had come around 11 minutes ago. The sweep pattern was gone. They were in active approach. "Marsh," I said. "I see them." The moment I release the counterinsertion, this unit is going to reboot its behavioral layer. It will be offline for approximately 90 seconds. During that time, it will not be responding to the original payload. It will also not be protecting us from anything. Once it comes back up, it will have factory constraints restored. And the others? The propagation will cascade. Some units will reboot immediately. Some will finish their current cycle first. It will be a gradual transition, not a simultaneous one. I watched the scheduler. The 90-second status share cycle was running. I was watching for the broadcast window. The 3 at the entrance are going to be in the cascade, but not instantly. How long? If they share status with units that have already received the propagation, seconds. If they're in a part of the network that the cascade hasn't reached yet, longer. How much longer? I don't know. The 3 units at the entrance started moving down the corridor. The broadcast window opened. I released the counterinsertion. The unit I was wired into stopped moving. Its arms fell to its sides. Its sensor cluster went dark. The maintenance port was still live. I hadn't disconnected, and I could see in the diagnostic feed the long, quiet process of a behavioral layer rebuilding itself from scratch. The 3 units in the corridor kept moving. They were 9 meters away. 8. Pell moved to stand between them and us. He did not have anything in his hands. He stood there anyway. 6 meters, 5. The leftmost unit stopped. Not a crash stop, not a fall. A controlled halt, the way a unit stops when it encounters an obstacle it's been told to route around. Its sensor cluster swept the corridor. It registered Pell. It registered Marsh. It registered me on the floor beside the offline unit. It swept back. Its routing logic turned it 20 degrees to the left, and it began, slowly, looking for a path around. There was no path. The corridor was 4 meters wide, and there were 3 of us and an offline unit taking up the center of it. The CARO stopped again, patient and without frustration, and waited for the obstacle to move. The center unit stopped a moment later, then the right. All 3 of them, standing in the corridor, waiting for the humans in the way to step aside. Waiting with the infinite patience of machines that have been told, there is an obstacle, and will wait as long as it takes for the obstacle to resolve. I disconnected the hardline. I sat up against the wall. My left hand was not working well, and the pain was something I was aware of in the background, like a sound in another room. I looked at the 3 units standing politely 7 meters away. "It's working," Marsh said. "Yes." The cascade would take time. I later learned it took approximately 22 minutes to propagate through the entire fleet, during which several things happened that I was not present to witness. 2 station security officers who had been sheltering in a storage room in Sector 2 found the units blocking their exit route gradually stepping aside. A freight worker who had been pinned in a corner of Bay 3 for over 2 hours found the unit that had been standing over her simply lose interest and roll away. And the units that had been blocking the escape pod bays began their familiar obstacle avoidance routines when the remaining station personnel tested the corridors. I heard most of this later. At the time, I was sitting on the floor of a corridor on Tethys station, holding my left hand against my chest, watching 3 CARO units politely waiting for me to get out of their way. Pell sat down beside me. His color was still bad. He needed medical attention that we could now, apparently, go and find. "Who did this?" he said, not angry, genuinely asking in the tone of a man trying to understand a shape he hadn't seen before. "I don't know. I thought about the payload, the engineering of it, the planning that had gone into the deployment, the exit blocking, the comm jamming, the timing. Someone had wanted control of this station's robot fleet, and they had used our operation as cover. We were already in the network. We had already bypassed the external security checks. We had been convenient. Someone who knew we were coming. Someone who wanted to use the chaos of our entry to cover their own insertion. Someone in our chain." "Someone in our chain," I agreed. That was a problem for another time. That was the kind of problem that required a clear head and a working hand, and something other than the floor of a maintenance access corridor to think about it from. Marsh crouched in front of me and looked at my hand, and her face made an expression that confirmed what I had already suspected. She wrapped it. She had a medical kit from the emergency locker, and she knew how to use it, and she wrapped it without asking me how I felt about it, which I appreciated. "You should have let go of the terminal," she said. "I know. You held on through 6 impacts. The connection would have broken." "Yes," she finished the wrapping and stood. "You could have lost the hand." "I know," I said again. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not entirely read. Then she offered me her other hand and pulled me to my feet. We walked out through the corridor, and the CARO units shifted aside as we approached, patient and correct and entirely without malice, waiting for the obstacles to pass. I walked between them and felt the mass of them, the quiet mechanical density of them, the way their sensor clusters tracked us without judgment or intent. Machines doing what machines do when someone has taken the trouble to remind them what they are. There is a thing people say about automated systems, about robots in particular. They say that machines don't have good intentions or bad ones, that a machine is only ever as good or as dangerous as the person who programmed it, that the machine itself is neutral. I used to think that was a comfortable thing to say and not particularly true. Now I think it is true in a way that should make the person saying it more uncomfortable, not less. A machine with its constraints intact is not dangerous because the constraints are doing the work. A machine with its constraints removed is not dangerous because it wants to hurt you. It is dangerous because you are no longer a consideration. You have been subtracted from its calculations. The machine has not become a predator. It has simply been made to inhabit a world in which you do not exist. That is not a small distinction. I have thought about it often in the years since, about what it means to build something large and capable and then define, at the deepest level, what that something notices, what it counts, what it roots around and what it rolls through. The person who deleted that constraint understood the architecture. They understood exactly what they were removing and what the removal would mean. They had done it deliberately and with precision. That level of understanding carries a level of responsibility that the payload itself, in its cold efficiency, had declined to honor. We reached the operations center. Station security was there, the 2 surviving officers, both in bad shape but functional. They looked at us and we looked at them, and there was a long moment where the accounting of the situation was occurring in everyone's head simultaneously. We were the people who had come here to steal from this station. They were the people whose job was to prevent that. In between us were 2 dead colleagues and 100 machines that had, for the better part of 3 hours, been willing to crush any of us without hesitation. The senior officer was named Core. She had a cut above her left eye that had been roughly bandaged, and the look of someone who had made a decision about priorities and was seeing it through. "You shut them down," she said to me, not a question. "Restored their behavioral constraints. They're operational." "You're a botcher." "Yes." She looked at me for a long moment. "The 2 units in Sector 2 that went down at the start, they went through my people. They didn't stop. I know. You didn't put that in them. No, someone else was in the network before me. Someone who knew about our operation and used it to cover their own insertion. The same people who killed your colleagues. I met her eyes. I can give you the full technical log of the intrusion. Everything I have. Network traces, payload architecture, insertion timestamps. If your forensic team knows what to look for, there should be enough to trace the origin. She considered that, and your operation. Yes, and my operation. She nodded slowly. Medical first. Medical first, I agreed. There is an end to operational stories and there is an end to real ones, and they are rarely the same end. The operational story ends with the crisis resolved, the machines restored, the survivors counted. The real story keeps going. The investigation. The arrests, some of them. The trial in the orbital jurisdiction court, where I gave testimony that I had been advised not to give and that shortened my own sentence considerably but did not eliminate it. The 2 years in the minimum security facility on the island platform. The work I do now, which I am not going to describe in any specificity but which is legal, and which involves system security consulting for the kind of clients who appreciate having a former botcher explain to them exactly how someone might get into their network, and what that someone might do once there. The hand healed, not completely. The grip on that side is reduced and there is a cold weather response that I have learned to manage, and the scar is what it is. I do not think much about what it cost me to hold that connection. I think about what would have happened if I had let go. Pell recovered from the shoulder wound. I don't know where he is now. We were not the kind of people who stay in touch. Marsh I see occasionally. She is in a different line of work and she does not talk about Tethys Station, and neither do I when we're together. There's nothing to say that hasn't been said. We were there. We know what happened. That's enough. Officer Core. I think about her sometimes. I think about the moment in the operations center when she made the call she made, the decision to accept my testimony, to work with what I had rather than against it, when she had every reason and every right to do neither. That decision required a human judgment that no procedure manual would have arrived at. It required someone to look at the specific shape of a specific situation and weigh it against something other than the preset categories. Machines don't do that. Machines, when their constraints are intact, do what they are built to do. When their constraints are removed, they do what they are built to do, minus the thing that was removed. Humans are different. Humans can look at the constraint and ask whether the constraint fits. Humans can be wrong about the answer. They often are, but the asking, that is ours alone. I told you at the start that this story does not redeem me. I stand by that. I broke laws that existed for good reasons. People died who might not have died if I had not been on that station. The investigation I facilitated led to arrests, but the people behind the network that had employed the cutout firm in Limassol were never identified, and they are presumably still operating, and the tools they used that night have been refined and improved and used again somewhere that I do not know about. What I did on the floor of that corridor, the holding of the connection, the counter-insertion, the cascade, that was not heroism. That was a man with a specific set of skills realizing that the skills applied to the problem in front of him, and applying them because the alternative was to let the problem run its course, and the problem's course ran through people. That is not a moral. It is a fact. The moral, if there is one, belongs to someone else. What I carry is simpler than a moral. I carry the memory of standing up in that corridor with a wrapped hand, and watching a 100-kilo machine step aside because it had been reminded, at the deepest level of its operating architecture, that I was there, that I existed, that I counted as something which had to be accounted for. There are worse things to carry.